It's difficult sometimes when reality does not match our expectations. When we thought something would be one way and it ended up being a different way. Maybe you booked a vacation and you saw the photos for what you thought was going to be your destination, and you showed up and realized they were carefully curated to show the very best parts and staged in such a way to look great, and you got there, it's not quite that way. Or you expected something from a friend or family member, or maybe at your workplace, and it didn't quite turn out to be what you thought. Maybe it's a product that was advertised to you to be one thing, and when you got it, it just did not live up to the hype. In the year 2017, our friends at Starbucks released something called the Unicorn Frappuccino. Hyped quite largely, looked like something maybe that Lisa Frank and Willy Wonka collaborated on to make. Raise your hand if you tried one. Just fess up. Anybody remember trying a unicorn frappuccino? It's like 2 of you. Some of you are just too embarrassed to admit it. Rave reviews, lots of people posting photos with it, big hype. I don't think the employees at Starbucks liked it because it created quite a few messes to make. Had quite a few problems when it was released. The first of which is that it contained twice as much sugar as a can of Dr. Pepper. So it's not exactly like a health tonic. And then the reviews came. Let me read you what one reviewer said about the Unicorn Frappuccino. He said, "It's one of the most fantastical looking substances I've ever put into my body. It looks like it's made of sunshine and rainbows. It tastes like Greek yogurt with mango juice at the bottom." In fact, this reviewer went on to say, "It's a mango slush underneath an astringent whipped cloud of sour evil. I don't know what I was expecting sunshine and rainbows to taste like, but it sure wasn't this." Sometimes the hype just sets you up for an even greater letdown. You go in expecting fireworks and you just end up getting static. Last week we began a series called Holy Ground, where we're taking significant places in Scripture and the things that happened there and seeing what they can tell us about God and ourselves. And last week we were at a place called Bethel, the house of God. And we saw Jacob there, who had an encounter with God unexpectedly. And we saw that God just shows up in different places, not on our terms, and his presence might be where we would miss it if we weren't looking otherwise. Today we find a new location and a new person. We meet a man named Elijah, who shows up in the book of 1 Kings really just out of nowhere. We don't have a lot of background on him. He shows up during the reign of King Ahab. And his first action is to tell the king that there will be no more rain and no food until he, Elijah, says so. Not a great start if you're trying to get in good with the king. But of course, Elijah's not. And so he finds himself then walking along with his friend who happens to work for the king. And his friend, Obadiah, says, "Look, man, I'm in a tough spot. The king wants you brought in. And if I don't bring you in, he's going to kill me." And so Elijah says, "Well, I'll just go turn myself in." And he turns himself in, but in such a way as to start a contest with King Ahab about who the true God is, because, see, King Ahab has drifted from the true God. And so they have this contest about who can light a soaked altar on fire. And Elijah and Elijah's God win the contest. That's, of course, embarrassing to King Ahab. So King Ahab goes home and he tells his wife, Jezebel, "You won't believe what happened with this prophet. He showed me up. Something's got to happen." And Jezebel said, "Well, let's put a hit out on him. He needs to go." And so Elijah goes from this triumphal moment at Mount Carmel to being on the most wanted list for the king and his wife. So Elijah flees. And he flees southward toward a place 1 Kings calls Mount Horeb, otherwise known as Mount Sinai. And I don't think Elijah's journey there is accidental. I think he knows where he's going, and he has hopes for what might happen when he gets there. Now, what has Elijah heard about this Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai place? Because at this point in Israel's history, the Exodus is the defining story. It's the thing that grandparents tell the grandchildren. It is the story that defines who their God is and who they are as a people. So Elijah might not have been walking around with a printed copy of the book of Exodus, but he's heard the stories. He knows about the miraculous deliverance from Egypt and the journey through the water and the food and provisions that God gave them on their journey. And he knows that after a few weeks, God's people arrived at the base of Mount Sinai. And that at that moment, God began speaking, and Moses began going up and down the mountain, talking to God in this pivotal moment. Elijah knows that God shows up at Mount Sinai. And again, he may not have a written copy, but he's heard the stories, and he knows what's happened there. He knows that when they got to Sinai, this is what happened. Exodus chapter 19. There was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. That's the story Elijah has heard. A smoke and light show, trumpets, earthquakes, and the voice of God. That's where he's headed. And so he begins his journey, and the first part of his journey is this humorous moment where he's just tired and hungry, and an angel comes and feeds him and gives him water, and he takes a nap, and he wakes up, and the angel feeds him and gives him water again, and he sleeps some more. This guy's exhausted. And he travels 40 days and nights. Now, you know that number. You know that's not incidental. That's a callback. Moses had some 40-day and night journeys too. And so Elijah is sort of retracing Moses' footsteps, whether he realizes it or not. Now, he doesn't take Moses' exact road. Jezreel isn't Egypt, and Beersheba isn't the Red Sea, but he's making a similar journey. And in all the ways that mattered, Elijah was walking in Moses' footsteps through the wilderness on the strength of a miraculous meal to hear the voice of God on the mountain where prophets encounter God. So he arrives at Mount Horeb and he goes into a cave for the night. And here's what happens with our friend Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 19. The word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. So the word of the Lord comes. We're not sure in this moment if he heard it or if he felt it. How did the word of the Lord show up for Elijah? But he asks what he's doing here, and Elijah answers truthfully. It's a lament. They're all doing wrong, I'm doing right, and they're out to get me. This isn't fair. And so the Lord said, go stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And here's the anticipation Elijah must feel. How will God show up for Elijah after this pointed complaint? And here's how the Lord shows up. A great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? It's this famous sequence of winds that tear mountains and shatter rocks, and earthquakes and fires. This is how God shows up, right? It's how he showed up for Moses. But here, he's showing up in a gentle whisper. Now, Elijah gets that something's happening because he covers his face when he goes to encounter it. But then a voice, now it's very clear it's a voice, asks him the same question. What are you doing here? So now Elijah has a chance to respond. He has encountered God. He whined and complained the first time. He gets a do-over. What are you doing here, Elijah? Now let's see what Elijah says. See if this sounds familiar. He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. It's the same response. Pretty much word for word. And I wonder if Elijah is sitting there in that moment thinking, I was told there would be thunder and lightning. Where is God when I need him? Moses gets fire and fear, and Elijah gets silence and a whisper. See here, God, he doesn't give Elijah what Moses needed. He gives Elijah what Elijah needs. Elijah may have thought that he needed Sinai 2.0 with all the smoke and fire and thunder. But God isn't going to offer reruns. He's going to offer exactly what this person needs. And on that same mountain where fire once fell, Elijah meets a God who no longer shouts, but whispers. And so what happens with his repetitive answer? I think sometimes we assume that an encounter with God will just change us immediately, and everything wrong with our soul will be fixed. And we're immediately going to answer and respond like fully devoted people who never get anything wrong anymore. And that's not what happens with Elijah. It's not what happens with him. It's not what happens with us when we encounter God, especially when we encounter God in ways we might not have expected, in ways that are different than what we hoped for or prepared for. But the bottom line is this: God speaks on his own terms. At Sinai with Moses, the people get the booming voice of God with thunder and lightning and smoke. And then the people say, please don't let God speak to us directly anymore. On this same mountain with Elijah, we get a gentle whisper. And Elijah is thinking, I want something more. In both cases, people don't get what they want, they get what they need. God is not going to be scripted. He's not summoned by our need for certainty. He's not obligated by the nostalgia we might feel for how he once showed up in a different way. He's not bound by our need for him to speak to us in the same way that he spoke to someone else. And yet he keeps speaking. At Sinai, they begged for God to stop speaking. And at Horeb, the same mountain by a different name, Elijah is begging him to start speaking. And in both cases, God doesn't give them what they asked for. He gives them what they needed. You and I don't get to choose the volume of God's voice. We only get to choose if we're going to listen or not. For me, I'm a minister, okay? I have never had a fire and smoke and lightning encounter with God. I've never even audibly heard anything. I have people tell me they have, and sometimes it's a mix of skepticism and envy when I hear that. Because I won't deny that it would happen for other people, although sometimes what they tell me God told them I'm a little sketchy about. But there's some envy too, like why can't I have those kinds of encounters? I even hear other ministers sometimes, and they'll talk about being called into ministry. And they had a definable moment when they knew They were supposed to do God's work for their life. For me, I had some really good youth ministers and really good encouraging adults tell me I had some gifts, and I pursued them. That's my story. And I know ministers who have a mix of those stories. Some can tell you, I was here and I heard God call me, and others are like, it just seemed to kind of work out. I've had moments in my life where I've cried out to God for help, for something that is happening to me or to my family, and I have begged God to intervene in a way I could see immediately. And many times it didn't happen like that. What I did notice is that I started feeling a little more peaceful day by day, and that things seemed to get a little better each day. And so there wasn't some moment when God showed up from the mountain with fire and lightning and fixed everything like that. But it doesn't mean that I can't tell you about God's presence in my life through the years. It just didn't happen in a fantastical kind of way. It's easy for us to look at other people and think they hear from God. He really shows up for them. It's easy to be Elijah looking back at Moses and thinking, why did he get that and I didn't? And so maybe you are waiting for a sign and all you've got is silence. Or you're in a room that once echoed with God's presence and it just feels hollow. Maybe you're on the flip side. You would really just like a whisper, but you're getting a lot of fire and thunder, and you weren't prepared for that. We don't get to dictate how God speaks, but we do get to decide whether we're listening, no matter what form the voice takes. So what do we do with this? We just stop assuming that God has to speak to us in the way that he used to or in the way that he seems to do for other people. And we open ourselves up to a whisper, or the thunder, or silence. And we trust that even in those places, God is present. Several years ago, I got a call from a friend who's about my age, and he had a very poignant request for me. He said, my dad is in the hospital. He's probably going to pass away today. We're not in town. Would you go and be with my mom? Of course. So I show up to the hospital room to a grieving woman and her other adult son. And in the background, you know the noises. It's the beeps. It's the sound of the ventilator. And so we sit down and I begin to talk with her about this man, her husband, who she'd been married to for decades. And I learned about him and his life. I heard what she was going through in those moments. And in the background, still more beeps, still more ventilator. And after a few hours, we prayed that God might receive his spirit and that those in the room might be comforted. And in the background, more beeps, more ventilator. And as the next moments dragged on, because they just felt that way, it was heavy, waiting. The beeps got slower, and the rhythm of the ventilator changed. And then after that, God spoke and received him. And just like a whisper, that moment was over. It wasn't loud and it wasn't dramatic, but I just keep coming back to that moment because I think that whisper carried the weight of God. Elijah didn't leave Mount Horeb with fireworks. He left with a whisper and a mission. And that whisper carried him the rest of the way. And may it also always carry us. Let's be standing.